There exists a colossal and largely misunderstood financial realm valued at approximately $600 trillion, an enormous market so complex and opaque that very few truly comprehend its intricacies. This vast and enigmatic sector played a pivotal role in nearly bringing down the entire global economy during the catastrophic financial crisis of 2008. Remarkably, it has since grown to be 10 times larger than it was back then, escalating its potential for destruction and instability. Back in 2003, the legendary investor Warren Buffett famously condemned derivatives by describing them as financial weapons of mass destruction, a warning that, with the benefit of hindsight, proved to be both prophetic and tragically accurate. These seemingly sophisticated financial tools were central to the fall of Lehman Brothers, the emergency rescue of the American International Group, and almost led to the complete collapse of the worldwide banking system. In the aftermath of that crisis, policymakers and regulators did not take the straightforward route of banning or even downsizing derivatives markets. Instead, they chose to permit their exponential growth. Instead of being dismantled, derivatives were allowed, and perhaps even encouraged, to expand further, making the financial system more vulnerable. Today, the total valuation of this derivatives marketplace surpasses 6 times the entire gross domestic product of the entire world. When the inevitable happens, and it most certainly will, this massive financial time bomb will unleash a shockwave so powerful that there won't be enough currency in existence to contain its damage, let alone save the global economy from complete ruin. Despite their vast significance, most ordinary people have never truly heard the term derivatives, and even seasoned investors often find it difficult to offer a clear explanation of what they are. These complicated financial instruments serve as the backbone of every major bank, every pension fund, every insurance corporation, and the entire network of government bonds around the globe. The supposed purpose of derivatives is to serve as tools for risk management. They are meant to allow institutions to hedge against potential losses and protect themselves from market fluctuations. However, in reality, derivatives frequently have the opposite effect by amplifying risk through a process of creating leverage, multiple layers of borrowed position, so that the overall exposure becomes far larger than the initial investment or risk assumed. This extensive layering of financial bets upon bets, leads to a dangerous and unstable situation where nobody truly knows who owes what to whom. It is this ambiguity, this opacity, that creates the perfect storm for a systemic meltdown. When the crisis of 2008 hit, it necessitated approximately $29 trillion in global bailouts, guarantees, and government interventions to stave off total economic disaster. At that time, the entire derivatives market was valued at around $60 trillion. Today, that figure has skyrocketed to about $600 trillion. When this financial ticking time bomb detonates, the fallout will extend across the entire planet instantly and irreversibly, causing chaos on a scale impossible to contain or control. Understanding why next time will be even more devastating than in 2008 requires a closer look at the nature of derivatives themselves. At their core, derivatives are financial contracts whose value is derived from an underlying asset, an idea that sounds straightforward until you realize just how broad and unpredictable that underlying asset can be. It could be a stock, a bond, a commodity such as oil or wheat, an interest rate, an exchange rate between two currencies, or even something far less tangible, like the weather conditions or the probability of a corporation defaulting on its debt. What makes derivatives particularly insidious is that owning one does not require owning the underlying asset itself. Instead, these contracts are essentially wagers on the future movement of the asset's value. In other words, you are betting on whether the price will go up or down, much like buying insurance against your neighbor's house burning down. You don't own the house, but you stand to collect if it does. This analogy illustrates the speculative nature of many derivatives, where the primary function is about taking positions on future market directions without necessarily having direct ownership or control of the underlying items. The most common variants of derivatives include futures, options, swaps, and forwards, each with its own unique features and uses. Futures contracts, for instance, are agreements to buy or sell a specific asset, such as oil, gold, or wheat, at a predetermined price at a future date. These are often utilized by producers and consumers to hedge against price fluctuations, thereby stabilizing costs and revenues. Options, on the other hand, grant the buyer the right, though not the obligation, to purchase or sell an asset at a designated price within a certain period, affording a flexible way to manage risk or speculate on market movements. Swaps involve exchanging cash flows, such as swapping a fixed interest rate for a variable one, allowing entities to tailor their financial exposures. Forward contracts are customized, private agreements between two parties to buy or sell an asset at a future date for a set price, often used by companies to lock in costs or revenue. Though these instruments can be used legitimately for hedging purposes, such as a farmer locking in the selling price of wheat before harvest, or an airline protecting itself against rising fuel prices, they have become tools that facilitate highly leveraged speculation. The danger lies in their potential to magnify risks exponentially, transforming the financial system into a fragile house of cards built on layered bets that can unravel with devastating speed when the underlying assumptions prove false. This complex web of dependence, opacity, and leverage creates an environment where, ultimately, the entire system remains on a knife's edge, ready to collapse under its own weight when market confidence erodes. A large corporation that operates with debts denominated in various foreign currencies often turns to derivatives known as swaps to effectively manage and hedge against potential exchange rate fluctuations. This approach helps mitigate the financial risks associated with currency volatility, ensuring that the company's obligations remain predictable regardless of shifts in global exchange markets. However, it is important to recognize that the derivatives market, unlike many simple hedging activities performed by farmers or commodity producers to stabilize wheat prices, is predominantly shaped by monumental financial institutions, particularly banks, that engage in highly leveraged speculative bets. These institutions actively trade derivatives related not just to currency exchange, but also to interest rates and credit risk, often using borrowed money to amplify their positions. This is where the danger lies. The core concept of a derivative's notional value is crucial to understanding the scale of risk involved. The notional, which simply reflects the face value of the underlying asset that the derivative contract references, can be extremely large, sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet, the amount of actual money at risk, the collateral that a bank must set aside, is often comparatively tiny. For instance, if a bank enters into an interest rate swap contract with a notional value of $100 million, the theoretical exposure on paper is indeed $100 million. In reality, however, the bank might only need to post collateral amounting to a mere $1 million to back this position, a ratio of 100 to 1. This means that a mere 1% unfavorable move in interest rates could wipe out the collateral completely, forcing the bank into a loss. Should the market move just 2% against the bank's position, it could find itself owing money it doesn't possess because the potential losses are magnified by leverage. When multiplied across thousands of such contracts held by multiple banks, the systemic risk becomes enormous. A small adverse market movement has the potential to trigger a chain reaction, leading to widespread financial instability or even collapse. The underlying issue fueling this instability is the sheer complexity of modern derivatives. These financial instruments have evolved into highly intricate and sophisticated products that often defy comprehensive understanding, even among their creators and traders. This complexity makes it incredibly difficult to forecast how these derivatives will behave under extreme stress conditions, such as during a financial crisis. Take credit default swaps, for example, one of the types of derivatives that played a pivotal role in causing the financial meltdown of 2008. These swaps were originally designed to serve as insurance contracts, allowing investors to protect themselves against the default of bonds or loans they owned. But in practice, they veered far from their intended purpose. Instead of being straightforward insurance, credit default swaps increasingly became speculative instruments, side bets placed by investors who didn't own the underlying bonds but wanted to gamble on whether those bonds would fail or not. This speculative use fundamentally transformed them into risky derivatives that magnified systemic vulnerability. The insurance giant AIG became infamous for selling hundreds of billions of dollars worth of such credit default swaps, without maintaining sufficient capital reserves to cover potential payouts. When the housing market bubble burst and mortgage defaults soared, AIG faced liabilities far exceeding its available assets. The company owed more money than it had, necessitating a massive financial rescue. To prevent AIG's collapse, which could have taken down the entire banking sector, the U.S. government intervened with an infusion of approximately $180 billion. This emergency bailout was necessary to stabilize AIG and prevent a domino effect of failures among major financial institutions. What makes derivatives especially terrifying, however, is their creation of counterparty risk, an insidious form of risk that can propagate through the financial network like a contagion. Imagine Bank A owes Bank B a sum of money based on a derivative contract. If Bank A suddenly fails or becomes insolvent, Bank B will not receive the owed funds. This failure then causes Bank B to be unable to meet its own obligations to Bank C, which, in turn, cannot fulfill its commitments to Bank D. As this chain continues, the failure of a single institution can trigger a domino effect, jeopardizing entire segments of the financial system. This phenomenon came sharply into focus during the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. At that time, Lehman held over $35 trillion in derivative contracts, an astronomical amount, when it declared bankruptcy. Suddenly, every counterparty that had traded with Lehman faced unexpected losses, many of which proved to be too large for these institutions to absorb. Some of them teetered on the brink of insolvency themselves, requiring government bailouts to stay afloat. Others, those that survived, became extremely cautious, restricting their transactions to only the most trustworthy entities. This paralysis drastically froze the credit markets, turning a localized financial problem into a global economic crisis marked by widespread recession and unemployment. The lessons from this catastrophic event should have prompted decisive action, most notably restrictions or outright bans on particularly dangerous types of derivatives. One such example is naked credit default swaps, where investors bet on bond defaults without actually owning the bonds themselves. These speculative instruments significantly amplified systemic risk and undermined financial stability. Instead of banning these risky products, the Dodd-Frank Act was introduced. It mandated some reporting requirements and moved certain derivatives to central clearinghouses to increase transparency. However, it did not substantially reduce the overall size of the derivatives market. Financial institutions argued earnestly that derivatives played a vital role in the economy. They claimed that these instruments were essential tools for managing various forms of risk, providing liquidity to markets, and enabling financial innovation. They insisted that banning derivatives altogether would hinder economic growth, reduce market efficiency, and ultimately cause more harm than good. Nonetheless, the experience of 2008 proved that without strict regulation and oversight, derivatives could spiral out of control, creating risks that threaten the entire financial system and, by extension, the global economy. Regulators either believed these financial entities or were too deeply influenced by industry lobbying efforts to take meaningful action. As a consequence, the derivatives market was not reduced in size following the 2008 financial crisis. Instead, it expanded dramatically, growing from a modest $60 trillion to an astonishing over $600 trillion in contemporary times. To truly grasp the magnitude of this explosive growth and understand its implications, it's essential to examine what transpired during the year 2008, when the market was still only around $60 trillion. Analyzing that period of upheaval reveals exactly why an unchecked derivatives industry of over $600 trillion poses a severe threat to the foundations of civilization itself. The financial turmoil of 2008 did not originate directly from derivatives. Rather, it was rooted in the rampant issuance of subprime mortgages, loans extended to borrowers with poor credit histories who could barely afford to make their payments. These high-risk loans were then assembled into mortgage-backed securities and sold to a wide array of investors across the globe. While the initial problem was in the lending practices and the proliferation of risky mortgages, it was the complex derivatives built upon this shaky foundation that transformed what could have been a contained housing bubble into a worldwide economic catastrophe. Banks didn't merely hold these mortgage loans on their books. They created intricate financial derivatives based on them, derivatives that served to amplify both the potential gains during a rising market and the devastating losses once the market turned. Take Lehman Brothers, for example, which, at the time of its collapse in September 2008, was the fourth largest investment bank in the United States. On paper, Lehman reported assets totaling $639 billion, with liabilities slightly higher at $613 billion, painting a picture of a company still solvent. However, the true extent of its financial peril was concealed within the footnotes of its financial statements. Hidden beneath the surface was a staggering exposure of over $35 trillion in notional derivatives, financial contracts whose value was not tied directly to assets owned by Lehman, but rather represented bets made with counterparties around the world. Most of these bets involved interest rate swaps and credit derivatives linked to the mortgage market. As housing prices began to decline in 2007, these derivative contracts started to lose value rapidly. Lehman's trading partners demanded additional collateral to back their positions, but Lehman could not meet these demands. By September of the same year, fear and suspicion had spread throughout the financial industry. Nobody was willing to trade with Lehman anymore, and everyone assumed that the bank was insolvent. The actual bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers was catastrophic in itself, but the real damage stemmed from the chain reaction it triggered. When Lehman collapsed, every derivative contract in which it was involved was effectively put into default, leaving many institutions exposed to enormous, unhedged losses. For instance, a European bank that had bought credit protection from Lehman found itself suddenly vulnerable to billions of dollars in mortgage-related losses, with no hedge remaining. Similarly, a pension fund that had entered into an interest rate swap agreement with Lehman was now unable to collect the payments owed to it. This interconnected web meant that Lehman's failure instantly propagated losses across hundreds of other financial institutions. Some of these institutions went bankrupt as a result, while others managed to survive but grew mistrustful of their counterparts, leading to a freeze in credit markets. The collapse of the American insurer AIG proved to be even more illustrative of the dangers posed by derivatives. AIG's downfall demonstrated how a single type of derivative, credit default swaps, could ultimately devastate a company with assets totaling $1 trillion. The financial products division of AIG had sold nearly $500 billion worth of these credit default swaps, effectively insuring banks and investors against losses on mortgage-backed securities. AIG collected premiums on these swaps, under the assumption that the risk was minimal since, historically, housing prices had not fallen nationwide before. But when the recession struck and property values began to decline sharply across the country, AIG found itself on the hook for tens of billions of dollars it lacked the cash to cover. As the company's financial health deteriorated, its credit rating was downgraded, activating clauses within the swaps that demanded immediate posting of additional collateral. AIG simply could not fulfill these demands, which precipitated a near collapse of its operations. This cascade of failures underscored a fundamental truth. The intricate architecture of these derivatives created layers of interconnected risk, and when one piece faltered, it set off a chain reaction threatening the entire global financial system. In summary, the 2008 crisis was not just a failure of bad loans or poor regulation. It was a systemic failure rooted in the complex, interconnected network of derivatives that had grown unchecked over the years. Their exponential expansion from a modest $60 trillion to an astronomical figure exceeding $600 trillion represents not just a financial anomaly, but a profound threat to the stability of civilization itself, one that demands careful understanding, oversight, and regulation. In September of 2008, the Federal Reserve intervened by providing a substantial emergency loan amounting to $85 billion. Aiming to stabilize the financial turmoil gripped the markets at that time. Despite this significant injection of liquidity, the measures proved insufficient to contain the rapidly spreading crisis. By the following March 2009, the government had extended an astonishing amount of support to the insurance giant American International Group, or AIG, an initial infusion that amounted to $180 billion. This was not only the largest bailout in the history of financial rescue efforts, but also a stark indicator of the severity of the financial collapse. However, The true nature of this bailout was far more complex than merely aiding AIG. It effectively served as a covert rescue operation for the major financial institutions that had engaged in purchasing credit default swaps from AIG. Large firms such as Goldman Sachs received around $12.9 billion, while Merrill Lynch obtained approximately $6.8 billion. Other giants like Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, and numerous additional financial entities also received billions of dollars each. Through this process, government funds funneled directly through AIG to ensure that these banks would not incur losses on their derivatives holdings. This situation illuminated a troubling reality about the world of derivatives trading. When these financial instruments fail, their losses are not simply erased, but are instead transferred onto the shoulders of taxpayers via bailout programs. It became painfully clear that the banks responsible for creating such risk were rescued from the fallout, because allowing them to fail would trigger a catastrophic collapse of the entire financial system. The cumulative expense of stabilizing the financial markets in that tumultuous period was staggering. The United States government committed approximately $700 billion through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, commonly known as TARP. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve engaged in a process called quantitative easing, which involved creating around $4 trillion out of thin air to inject into the economy. On a global scale, other governments and central banks collaborated by providing an additional $25 trillion in the form of loans, guarantees, and bailouts. When all these efforts are summed up, the total financial commitment reached an estimated $29 trillion, nearly twice the size of the entire U.S. economy at that time. All of this immense effort was aimed at averting an outright collapse of a derivatives market that was valued at approximately $60 trillion in notional value, a measure of the total face value of derivatives contracts. Although the system was ultimately preserved, albeit narrowly, the fundamental lesson remained unlearned. Derivatives had become excessively large and complex, so much so that no single entity, regulator, or policy could effectively control or oversee their vast scope. Recognizing the urgent need for reform, the Dodd-Frank Act was enacted in 2010 with the intention of imposing stricter regulations on derivatives markets. Its main provisions required certain standardized derivatives to be traded through centralized clearinghouses, which would, in theory, mitigate counterparty risk by having a central entity guarantee the fulfillment of both sides of every trade. Additionally, it mandated increased transparency through comprehensive reporting requirements so that regulators could better understand who held what within these markets. However, despite these measures, the Act fell short in several crucial aspects. It did not set limits on the overall size of the derivatives market, nor did it prohibit the most dangerous and opaque types of derivatives. Furthermore, it failed to address the core problem that banks continued to use extreme levels of leverage, moistening their bets with depositor funds and taxpayer-backed guarantees, making the entire system still dangerously exposed to potential collapse. Within a few years, strong lobbying efforts succeeded in weakening the modest reforms that had been implemented. As a result, the derivatives market resumed its rapid growth. By the year 2015, it exceeded a staggering $600 trillion in notional value. Fast forward to late the year 2025. This market has continued expanding and now stands at over $600 trillion, an almost incomprehensible figure. To put this into perspective, the total gross domestic product of the entire world is roughly $100 trillion. Therefore, the derivatives market is about 6 times larger than the global economy. If even a mere 5% of these derivatives were to fail suddenly, it would result in losses amounting to about $30 trillion. 3 times the total cost of the bailouts carried out in 2008. Such a scale of loss is unthinkable to absorb through any existing mechanism, financial resource, or policy measure without causing a total meltdown of the global financial system. Adding to the peril is the composition of the derivatives market itself, which makes it even more threatening. The most dominant category, interest rate derivatives, alone accounts for over $500 trillion of the total outstanding notional value. This vast dominance underscores how deeply embedded and potentially fragile the entire financial framework has become, highlighting that the risks involved are not only enormous, but also intricately woven into the very fabric of the international monetary system. These are financial contracts, known as derivatives, that are primarily designed to speculate on, or hedge against, fluctuations in interest rates and their associated volatility. Banks and financial institutions employ these instruments not only to manage their exposure to changes in rates, but also to take advantage of favorable movements, aiming to profit from market shifts. When interest rates remain relatively stable over time, these derivatives tend to appear safe and manageable, giving a false sense of security. However, the underlying risk can rapidly amplify when rates experience swift and unpredictable changes, which has been the case over the past 3 years. Between 2021 and 2023, the Federal Reserve undertook a historic campaign of increasing interest rates from nearly 0 to over 5%, marking the fastest rate hiking cycle in 4 decades. Each step upward in interest rates created a complex web of outcomes. Some market participants, including certain institutions and investors, gained substantial profits, while others incurred significant losses. These losses, accumulated during the period of rapid rate increases, are currently embedded within bank balance sheets. Yet, many banks have concealed these mounting losses through accounting strategies that allow them to avoid the necessity of marking these positions to their current market value, sometimes called marking to market, which can often obscure the true extent of their exposure. The second largest category of derivatives holds an estimated notional value of approximately $50 trillion. This category includes credit default swaps, infamous for their role in the collapse of the insurance giant AIG during the financial crisis of 2008. Despite promises made by regulators after that crisis to overhaul and tighten oversight of this market, little meaningful change has taken root. Banks and hedge funds continue to utilize credit default swaps freely to speculate on the likelihood of corporate or sovereign defaults. The problem has intensified because, since 2008, corporate debt levels have skyrocketed from around $2 trillion to over $10 trillion within the United States alone by the year 2025. A significant portion of this debt was issued during a period of historically low interest rates, rates that no longer exist in the current environment. As corporations seek to refinance their debt at higher prevailing rates, some will inevitably default on their obligations. When defaults occur at scale, the credit default swaps, contracts written to protect against such defaults, will trigger massive payouts. If enough companies default simultaneously, the institutions that sold protection will face losses so substantial that they could be forced into insolvency. This scenario closely resembles the crisis involving AIG, with the crucial difference that, this time, the Federal Reserve has no willingness to inject another $180 billion to bail out these derivative sellers. In addition to interest rate and credit derivatives, there exists a vast and complex universe of currency derivatives, estimated to have a notional value of about $100 trillion. These instruments are particularly susceptible to shocks related to exchange rate fluctuations. The United States dollar has served as the world's primary reserve currency for over 80 years, underpinning global trade and finance. However, its dominance is gradually eroding as several major economies, such as China, Russia, and India, are increasingly engaging in trade using their own local currencies rather than the dollar. Moreover, countries like Saudi Arabia are accepting the United Arab Emirates dirham for oil transactions, bypassing dollar-denominated trade entirely. Should the dollar lose its reserve currency status, or even weaken substantially in value, currency derivatives could experience violent, unpredictable swings. Financial institutions that rely heavily on the assumption of dollar stability might find themselves on the wrong side of trillion-dollar bets. The rippling effects of such a scenario would spread rapidly across all markets: stock markets, bond markets, commodity prices, and international trade flows, causing chaos and widespread financial instability. Perhaps most insidious is the sheer complexity of modern derivatives. Even after the financial crisis of 2008, banks did not simplify their derivative books. Instead, they often layered additional complexity by creating derivatives on derivatives, effectively nesting financial products within one another. Today, it is possible to purchase options on credit default swaps or swaps based on indices of other swaps, leading to an intricate web of interconnected derivatives. This nesting approach magnifies leverage exponentially, so that a modest shift in the value of the underlying asset can trigger disproportionately large movements throughout the entire pyramid of derivatives. This interconnectedness makes it almost impossible to accurately model or predict how these financial products will behave under extreme stress conditions. The mathematical models used by banks and traders often assume normal market conditions, continuous liquidity, and that all counterparties will fulfill their obligations, assumptions that rarely hold true during times of crisis. In essence, despite the advanced nature of these financial instruments, their underlying structures are built upon assumptions that do not account for turmoil or extreme market disruptions. This inherent fragility, combined with their mounting complexity, poses a serious threat to global financial stability, a threat that could trigger a crisis far more severe than anyone currently anticipates. During times of financial crisis, the assumptions that underpin our conventional understanding of markets simply cease to hold water. In such tumultuous periods, liquidity dries up almost completely, leaving markets trading in a state of stark illiquidity. Price movements become violently erratic, often jumping in sudden, unpredictable gaps, and counterparties, those entities we rely on to facilitate trades, begin to default on their commitments. It is precisely under these conditions that even the most sophisticated models falter, revealing their limitations and exposing the vulnerability of our financial systems. The losses incurred during such turmoil often far surpass what even the most experienced risk managers had anticipated, revealing a disconcerting gap between theory and reality. Now, allow me to share something that should genuinely alarm anyone paying close attention. The concentration of financial derivatives, the complex financial instruments whose value is derived from underlying assets, within a handful of large institutions dramatically amplifies the fragility of the entire system. In the United States, a striking majority, around 90%, of all derivative exposure is held by merely 4 banks. These are the same financial giants that required bailouts during the crisis of 2008, and remarkably, they have since grown even larger, with leverage ratios that push the boundaries of prudence. Among them, JP Chase stands out as the largest holder of derivatives in the country, with an approximate notional exposure of around $54 trillion, according to the latest regulatory disclosures. To grasp the scale, consider this. JP Chase's total assets are about $3.7 trillion, and its equity, its own capital, is roughly $300 billion. When you compare these figures, it becomes evident that JP Morgan's derivative exposure is roughly 180 times its equity capital. The bank contends that the notional value, the face value of all derivatives, overstates the actual risk, arguing that many of these derivatives are part of hedging strategies where positions offset each other, thus reducing net risk. JP Morgan claims that its current net credit exposure from derivatives is merely about $50 billion, a tiny sliver compared to the total notional amount. This assertion sounds somewhat comforting, yet history warns us not to take it at face value. Before the catastrophic collapses of Lehman Brothers and the near collapse of AIG, financial institutions were also reassured by similar hedging assertions, believing their positions were safe because of offsetting offsets. But hedges, no matter how sophisticated, can unravel when it matters most, when a counterparty defaults or markets turn illiquid. When this happens, the hedges disappear, and the gross exposure, the total amount at risk, becomes the only figure that truly matters. Turning to other major banks, Citibank holds approximately $48 trillion in derivatives at a notional level, supported by total assets of about $2.4 trillion and capital of roughly $200 billion. Bank of America's derivative exposure is around $37 trillion, against $3.1 trillion in assets and capital of roughly $280 billion. Goldman Sachs, although somewhat smaller than the commercial banks, still carries an impressive derivative position, about $47 trillion, against total assets of approximately $1.6 trillion and capital of around $120 billion. When you combine these 4 financial giants, JP Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs, their aggregate derivative holdings reach nearly $186 trillion. That's a staggering number, equivalent to nearly double the entire gross domestic product of the global economy. This colossal concentration of derivatives creates a risk that is difficult to overstate. Should any one of these banks make a catastrophic mistake or mismanage these positions profoundly, the resulting losses could truly surpass their entire capital multiple times over, leading to insolvency and potentially triggering a chain reaction of financial instability. The common argument made in their defense is that these institutions are highly sophisticated, equipped with advanced risk management systems, employing thousands of quantitative analysts, and subject to rigorous regulatory oversight. Yet, history repeatedly demonstrates that such sophistication does not eliminate the threat of disaster. On the contrary, it can sometimes enable it. Complexity in risk models can lend a false sense of security, encouraging banks to take on larger and more risky positions than they would if they relied on simpler, more transparent analysis. The collapse of long-term capital management in 1998 serves as a stark reminder. This hedge fund employed some of the brightest minds, including 2 Nobel laureates, and relied on cutting-edge mathematical models to manage its risks. Despite all this, despite employing the best available quantitative techniques, the fund lost about $4.6 billion in just 4 months and had to be saved by a bailout totaling approximately $3.6 billion arranged by the Federal Reserve. The reason? Its failure posed an existential threat to the entire financial system, revealing that even the most advanced models and brightest minds cannot fully predict or prevent systemic collapse. At that time, LTCM's derivative exposure stood at around $1 trillion, a staggering amount that underscored just how intertwined and fragile the financial network had become. The current universe of derivatives markets is staggering in its size, totaling around $25 trillion, a figure that constitutes only a small fraction compared to the immense holdings of the leading 4 global banking giants. These colossal banks, often referred to as the Big Four, command vast assets, but their interconnected web of financial relationships forms a complex and delicate network, where the fate of one can significantly influence the stability of all others. Within this network, each institution's survival is intricately linked to the continued solvency of its counterparts, creating a fragile balance that is vulnerable to unexpected shocks or failures. To illustrate how these connections work in practice, consider a hypothetical chain of hedging strategies. JP Morgan may have sought to protect itself from fluctuations in interest rates by entering into swap agreements with Citibank. In turn, Citibank could have offset its own interest rate risk through similar swaps with Bank of America. That bank, meanwhile, might have hedged its position through contracts with Goldman Sachs, and Goldman Sachs, completing the circular chain, might have held swaps back with JP Morgan. On paper, these positions appear balanced and offsetting, designed to mitigate risk across the network. However, in reality, such arrangements create a series of circular dependencies. If one link in the chain weakens or fails, it triggers a cascade of losses across the entire web. The supposed hedges no longer serve their purpose, and the financial stability of each participating bank comes under threat. This complex web of interlinked positions was at the heart of the financial turmoil in 2008, during the collapse of Lehman Brothers. That event transformed what might have been an isolated failure into a systemic crisis because every major bank had some level of exposure to others through derivatives, financial contracts that derive their value from underlying assets or rates. When Lehman went bankrupt, the domino effect caused panic and losses across the entire banking system. Suddenly, banks faced the urgent question: if one institution fails, what guarantees do the others have that their own exposures won't unravel? The realization that these interconnected derivatives posed a systemic risk spurred reforms designed to address these vulnerabilities. One of the key responses was the implementation of central clearing requirements after the crisis. The idea was to have a dedicated clearinghouse act as an impartial intermediary between buyers and sellers of derivatives, effectively guaranteeing the completion of each trade, regardless of the counterparties involved. This adjustment was intended to eliminate direct counterparty risks and reduce the likelihood of a chain reaction in case of a default. However, while effective for standardized derivatives traded on official exchanges, this reform left untouched a far larger segment of the derivatives market, namely, over-the-counter or OTC derivatives. These are highly customized contracts negotiated privately between banks and financial institutions, often with terms that do not go through central clearing mechanisms. The vast majority of the world's derivatives market, estimated at more than $600 trillion, remains outside of these clearinghouses, with bilateral agreements still carrying the same systemic risk factors as before. In other words, if one major bank in these OTC contracts were to fail unexpectedly, the counterparties involved would face significant losses without any central entity stepping in to absorb or guarantee those losses. This situation echoes the pre-crisis vulnerabilities that led to the 2008 financial meltdown. Although reforms and regulations have been put in place, they largely address form rather than substance, and the core systemic issues persist beneath the surface, lurking within the vast and opaque OTC derivatives market. Now, turning our attention to the imminent threats that could ignite the next derivatives crisis, I want to highlight some specific triggers that are already beginning to surface. Several of these factors are poised to activate within the coming year to year and a half, creating substantial instability in the financial landscape. The most apparent danger is the volatility in interest rates. Today, the derivatives market linked to interest rates alone is estimated at more than $500 trillion, an enormous volume sufficient to amplify any shocks. Over the past 4 decades, interest rates have experienced the most pronounced swings, with the period from 2008 to 2021 characterized by near-zero rates that fostered an environment of stability. During that time, banks and financial institutions could take substantial positions in interest rate derivatives without fearing large-scale shocks since rates remained relatively flat and predictable. However, the situation shifted dramatically in 2022 when the Federal Reserve embarked on a rapid series of rate hikes, boosting rates from near zero to above 5% in just over a year and a half. This aggressive tightening of monetary policy introduced immediate stress into the financial system, especially for banks holding long-term fixed-rate assets. As short-term interest rates rose swiftly, these banks faced mounting losses on their portfolios of fixed-rate loans and securities, losses that were initially concealed but nonetheless real. Some of these distress signals became evident in the failures of major banks like Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic in the early part of 2023. Yet the most significant risks remain hidden deep within derivatives positions that banks are not required, by current accounting standards, to mark to market regularly. This means that many of the losses are effectively obscured until they reach a point where they can no longer be hidden or absorbed quietly. The danger heightens further if the Federal Reserve finds itself in a dilemma, struggling to balance fighting inflation against the need to prevent a broad recession. Should inflation persist at elevated levels and the Fed decide to keep interest rates high or even raise them further, new losses will inevitably accumulate on interest rate derivatives held by financial institutions. Conversely, if economic data sour and the Fed responds by cutting rates rapidly to stimulate growth, different sets of institutions will bear the brunt of losses associated with those bets. Each scenario creates a set of losses large enough to threaten the financial health of substantial parts of the banking system. Moreover, if the Federal Reserve vacillates, raising rates to combat inflation, then cutting them in response to economic weaknesses, the resulting volatility might exceed the risk models used by banks to prepare for such events. Such unpredictable swings could trigger margin calls, demands for additional collateral, and force extensive sell-offs and liquidations, further amplifying instability. In summary, these vulnerabilities are already beginning to make themselves felt, with the potential to escalate into a full-blown crisis unless carefully managed. The interconnected nature of modern financial markets, combined with the scale and opacity of derivatives trading, means that shocks, whether from interest rate movements or other factors, could rapidly escalate into systemic failures, reminiscent of the past, but on an even larger scale. The potential for widespread financial turmoil is increasingly linked to several key triggers within the global economic system, each capable of unleashing a chain reaction of crises. One of the foremost concerns involves defaults in the commercial real estate sector, which now pose a significant threat by themselves. In the coming years, an estimated amount exceeding $2 trillion in commercial mortgages must be refinanced within the span of just 24 months. These loans were originally issued under much lower interest rates, but due to recent market shifts, refinancing will now be necessary at interest rates that are 3 times higher than those prevalent at the time of initial financing. Such a dramatic increase in borrowing costs is likely to render many property owners unable to meet their debt obligations, leading to a surge in defaults across the commercial real estate landscape. As properties default, this chain of failures will activate a ripple of financial instruments known as credit derivatives, specifically credit default swaps, CDS, that are written on securities backed by commercial mortgages, commonly known as commercial mortgage-backed securities, CMBS. Institutions that had sold protection against potential defaults in these securities could suddenly find themselves obliged to pay out substantial sums, often much larger than anticipated. The size of the market for these collateralized securities is significant, amounting to roughly $600 billion. While not alarming in isolation, a spike in default rates could cause derivative payouts to escalate into tens of billions of dollars. Such a scenario, although unlikely to cause the entire financial system to collapse instantly, would nevertheless weaken multiple regional banks and could set off a sequence of failures that cascade through the banking network. This fragility arises because many financial institutions are interconnected through these complex derivative contracts, leading to widespread vulnerabilities. Another major source of systemic risk stems from stress within the European banking sector. This is already evident in the numerous cracks appearing within large financial institutions across Europe. For example, in March of the year 2023, Credit Suisse faced a sudden and severe crisis, culminating in its forced acquisition by UBS through a government-mandated merger. During the same period, Deutsche Bank experienced a notable spike in its credit default swap spreads, as investors grew increasingly concerned about its ability to meet its obligations and remain solvent. Both of these banks are enormous players in the derivatives market, with Deutsche Bank alone holding exposure valued at over $40 trillion in notional terms. Should one of these major European banks fail, it would set off a chain reaction, triggering losses at American banks that have significant derivative exposure to these institutions. Because derivative contracts create a web of intertwined financial interests worldwide, a failure in Frankfurt or Zurich would have immediate repercussions across global markets. For instance, the financial health of JP Morgan Chase in New York is directly affected by such European failures, owing to the derivatives linking these entities across continents. Adding to these threats is the peril posed by sovereign debt crises in prominent economies around the world, which represent perhaps the most dangerous triggers of all. Such crises combine multiple layers of financial risk, credit risk, currency risk, and interest rate risk, all at once. Consider Japan, which has accumulated government debt exceeding 260% of its gross domestic product, the highest among developed nations. For decades, Japan maintained near-zero interest rates, creating an illusion of financial stability. However, recent inflationary pressures and increasing global rate trends threaten to force the Bank of Japan into a tightening cycle. If Japan is compelled to raise interest rates significantly, or if global investors lose confidence in Japanese bonds, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Japanese yen might plunge, and the country's government bonds could default. The exposure to Japanese sovereign debt through derivatives and other financial instruments is vast on a global scale. A crisis stemming from Japan's debt crisis would ignite a wave of losses across major financial institutions worldwide, as they hold or have insured Japanese bonds through complex derivative arrangements. Similarly, China faces a comparable set of risks. Its local governments are burdened with debts exceeding $13 trillion, much of which is concealed in off-balance sheet vehicles designed to evade transparency and regulation. The real estate market, which accounts for about 30% of China's entire economy, is presently collapsing. Prominent developers such as Evergrande and Country Garden have defaulted on hundreds of billions of dollars of debt, unleashing chaos into the financial system. As losses from these defaults spread, banks, insurance companies, and other financial entities that sold credit derivatives linked to Chinese debt are about to face substantial payout obligations. Since many Western and American financial institutions hold derivative contracts tied to Chinese debt instruments, a meltdown in China's financial system could have an immediate and severe impact on their stability. What must be understood most critically is that when the derivatives market begins to unravel on such a scale, it is unlikely that any government or central bank will be able to step in with a bailout large enough to halt the cascade. The interconnectedness of these financial products means that traditional measures of intervention will be insufficient, and the resulting fallout could cascade globally, affecting economies and institutions that are seemingly insulated from such risks. In the year 2008, an unprecedented concerted effort took place among governments and central banks worldwide, as they collectively committed a staggering sum of approximately $29 trillion to prevent a total financial collapse. To put this into perspective, that colossal figure was roughly equivalent to about 40% of the entire global gross domestic product at that time. This massive intervention required an extraordinary degree of coordination. Virtually every major government had to work in harmony, and every central bank had to launch simultaneous monetary expansion by printing enormous quantities of money. Equally crucial was the political consensus, accepting and implementing measures that, just a few years earlier, would have been considered unthinkable or politically impossible. While this massive rescue operation succeeded in averting an immediate collapse, the outcome was only marginally successful. The aftermath was a prolonged period of economic sluggishness that persisted for over a decade, accompanied by soaring levels of government debt and a series of political upheavals and unrest that are still echoing in contemporary society. Today, the derivatives market alone carries a staggering notional value of about $600 trillion. If merely 10% of that colossal amount were to turn bad or default, it would translate into losses of around $60 trillion, an amount surpassing more than twice what was needed to contain the damage in the 2008 crisis, and exceeding yet half of the entire global gross domestic product. No existing government has anywhere near that kind of financial capacity. They are already overwhelmed by debts accumulated from pandemic-related spending, previous bailouts, and demographic shifts that strain economies further. For instance, the national debt of the United States stands at approximately $36 trillion, a number that is both enormous and unsustainable in the long term. European countries face similar levels of leverage, their economies burdened with comparable or even higher debt loads. Japan presents an even more dire situation, with its debt amounting to well over 260% of its gross domestic product, values that seem beyond hope of repayment. Although China states that its official debt levels are relatively low, it harbors significant hidden liabilities and obligations that are not publicly acknowledged and are difficult to quantify. Under these circumstances, it is impossible for any of these governments to borrow another $10 or $20 trillion in an attempt to bail out derivative traders and prevent cascading defaults. The implications of such borrowing are catastrophic. The bond markets would be overwhelmed, collapsing under the weight of new debt issuance. While central banks might theoretically attempt to print money through quantitative easing to cover these losses, such a measure would have profound and severe repercussions. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, for example, expanded from less than $1 trillion before 2008 to a peak of approximately $9 trillion during the COVID-19 pandemic. This immense expansion of money supply directly fueled the inflationary surge experienced between 2021 and 2023, which marked the most significant inflationary spike in over 40 years. If the Federal Reserve or any other central bank were to attempt printing an additional $20 trillion to cover derivatives losses, the consequences would be dire. The resulting inflation would be catastrophic. The value of the national currency, the dollar in this case, would plummet. Imported goods would become prohibitively expensive, and real wages, what people actually earn in terms of purchasing power, would collapse rapidly. The social fabric would be strained to breaking point, igniting widespread unrest, protests, and potentially even violent disorder. At a certain point, resorting to excessive money printing in a desperate attempt to save the financial system can annihilate the currency itself, leading to a full-blown currency crisis. Such crises are often more devastating than conventional financial collapses because they impact everyone, ordinary citizens, businesses, and governments alike, eroding trust in the monetary system itself. Furthermore, the political will to undertake another massive bailout appears to be completely absent. Back in 2008, The public was shocked by the scale of the crisis, but largely resigned. Governments justified their intervention by arguing that the survival of the banking system was essential to prevent the entire economy from collapsing. Despite their discontent, most ordinary people accepted these measures, recognizing that some sacrifices were necessary to prevent complete economic and social breakdown. However, that sense of acceptance has vanished over the last 15 years. The same bailouts that ostensibly saved the banks did little to improve the lives of average citizens. Wages stagnated, housing became increasingly unaffordable, and wealth inequality, already alarmingly high, exploded to new levels. The next financial crisis is poised to strike at a moment when public trust in institutions has eroded sharply, political polarization has intensified, and populist movements on both the left and right are demanding accountability, with many insisting that the wealthy and powerful should bear the brunt of the costs for past failures. If governments attempt to carry out another round of bailouts for banks and large financial institutions, they are likely to encounter fierce resistance, which could escalate into widespread unrest that might become unmanageable. The once accepted doctrine of too big to fail, which justified massive bailouts in 2008, has now morphed into what can be called too big to save. The banking institutions are now larger, far more leveraged, and intricately interconnected than they were in the earlier crisis. Their derivative portfolios are 10 times bigger, their balance sheets are more complex and opaque, making the situation vastly more fragile and dangerous. The interconnectedness of the global financial system is such that a failure in one area has the potential to ignite crises across the entire network, quickly spreading chaos and instability. Unfortunately, many of the fundamental resources and capacities that once allowed nations or institutions to intervene effectively have significantly diminished over the past 15 years. Today, governments' ability to borrow vast sums, central banks' credibility, political resolve, and available financial resources have all been considerably curtailed compared to what they were in the recent past. This deterioration means that the financial system has expanded well beyond what any single government or institution can realistically manage or rescue in the event of a crisis. Adding to the complexity, there's an inherent mathematical problem specific to modern derivatives that didn't exist in traditional banking assets. When a bank holds non-performing or bad mortgages, the government can step in, purchase those distressed assets, absorb the losses directly, and, once the housing market stabilizes, recover some of its investment. Although this approach is costly, it remains straightforward and understandable. The government essentially takes ownership of the bad assets, bears the losses, and waits for an eventual recovery. However, derivatives are fundamentally different. These financial instruments aren't physical assets, but rather contractual agreements between two or more parties. They serve as bets or hedges, and their failure doesn't lead to a simple loss of an underlying asset. Instead, it results in one party losing and the other gaining, depending on how the contracts unfold. When a derivative contract collapses or becomes worthless, there's no tangible asset to seize or recover. It's purely a matter of transferring wealth from one side to another. If the government attempts to step in and bail out the losing party, it isn't restoring any real value or underlying asset, but simply transferring wealth to the winning side. Such a move doesn't serve any productive economic purpose. It's akin to rewarding speculation or risky gambling at taxpayers' expense. Furthermore, the opacity and complexity of the derivatives market greatly hinder any efforts to identify who should be rescued or bailed out. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, it took months to unravel the tangled web of derivative contracts and determine the true extent of obligations. In a systemic crisis where multiple financial giants falter at once, this process would become vastly more complicated and prolonged. The sheer number of offsetting contracts, bilateral negotiations, and intricate netting arrangements would make it nearly impossible to untangle the mess quickly. It could take years to fully understand who owes what and to whom, by which time the real economy would probably have entered a deep recession or depression. Recognizing that, the fundamental problem lies in trying to rescue a financial system that's too complex to comprehend fully. There are currently assets estimated at around $600 trillion in the derivatives market, an amount 10 times larger than the one that nearly caused a global collapse in 2008. This enormous market is dominated primarily by just four major banks, any of which, if it were to fail, could bring down the entire modern financial infrastructure. The danger is even more imminent, as multiple triggers are likely to activate within the next 12 to 18 months, risking this fragile edifice with no reasonable way to contain or bail it out should things go awry. Renowned investor Warren Buffett emphasized the gravity of the situation as far back as 2003, when he described derivatives as financial weapons of mass destruction. Since then, his warning has been proven repeatedly correct. Yet, instead of disarming or reducing these dangerous instruments, the response across the financial landscape has been to create even more complex and large-scale derivatives, effectively building bigger weapons rather than fostering disarmament. The impending crisis might begin with an increase in interest rate volatility, as the Federal Reserve hesitates between fighting inflation and preventing a recession. Alternatively, it could start with a wave of defaults in the commercial real estate sector, which would cascade through credit derivatives, triggering widespread panic. Other possible causes include the failure of a significant bank in Europe, a debt crisis in Japan, or a major collapse within the Chinese real estate market. The specific catalyst is almost secondary because the entire system has become so fragile that any substantial shock, regardless of its origin, would be enough to ignite a full-blown financial meltdown. When one of the critical banks fails to meet its derivative obligations, it can set off a chain reaction. Counterparties, finding their hedging strategies ineffective, face mounting losses. Margin calls force more securities to be sold quickly, amplifying the downward pressure. Central clearinghouses, which are meant to contain and manage risk, then confront losses that threaten their solvency. Within a matter of hours or days, virtually every major financial institution worldwide could be confronting losses they simply cannot absorb, leading to a domino effect of defaults and financial distress. In response to such crises, governments would almost certainly declare emergency measures, attempting to stabilize the markets and prevent total collapse. However, given the immense scale and complexity of the current derivatives market, a market so vast and intertwined that it defies comprehensive understanding, such measures may ultimately prove insufficient, and the situation could spiral out of control. The Federal Reserve is preparing to establish a series of lending facilities designed to provide liquidity and stabilize the financial system in times of crisis. Meanwhile, central banks around the world are engaging in coordinated efforts, working together to try and contain the inevitable fallout of mounting financial tensions. Politicians are giving speeches that emphasize their commitment to protecting the stability of the entire system, reassuring the public that measures are in place. However, despite all these efforts, none of these strategies will ultimately succeed in preventing a systemic collapse because the underlying problem is simply too vast and complex to be managed through conventional means. It is impossible to bail out losses that amount to more than half of the entire value produced by the global economy in a single year. Printing enough money to cover such massive losses would inevitably depreciate the currency to a point where its purchasing power collapses altogether. Likewise, negotiating debt forgiveness on enough loans and obligations to make insolvent banks solvent again is an unattainable goal because the numbers involved defy feasible solutions. The math simply does not add up. The scale of the problem surpasses the capacity of monetary policy or bailouts to address it effectively. What lies beyond the imminent explosion of the derivatives market is fundamentally unpredictable because we are dealing with a type of crisis never before experienced at this magnitude. The Great Depression, though devastating, played out over many years, which granted society time to respond, adapt, and recover gradually. In contrast, a cascade triggered by derivatives could unfold in just days or weeks, moving at such an incredible speed that policy responses would lag far behind the crisis's rapid advance. In such a scenario, bank accounts could be swiftly frozen as financial institutions are forced into receivership or insolvency. Credit cards could suddenly become unusable, cutting off access to essential liquidity. Pension funds, heavily invested in complex financial products, could show losses so enormous that millions of people's retirement prospects would be effectively obliterated, leaving them unable to plan for a secure future. The ensuing economic chaos would be profound. Supply chains would break down, leading to shortages of critical goods, and unemployment levels could surge to heights not seen since the bleakest days of the 1930s. This is not merely a matter of speculation or a warning of doom. Instead, it is a clear recognition rooted in pattern analysis and straightforward mathematics. The financial markets already experienced a severe crisis in 2008 when around $60 trillion worth of assets were destroyed, causing widespread economic damage. Despite massive bailouts, the size of the derivatives market has since grown tenfold, reaching an astonishing $600 trillion. The capacity of governments and central banks to intervene and dampen such a catastrophe has been exhausted, leaving us vulnerable. Signs of potential triggers are emerging right now, indicating that the inevitable cascade is approaching. The tipping point is merely a matter of time and scale. And, alarmingly, the likelihood is that the crisis will occur sooner and with greater severity than most people expect. Historically, whenever a financial weapon of mass destruction has been created, such as these extensive derivatives exposures, it has eventually been detonated, unleashing widespread destruction. Derivatives, which now total around $600 trillion in highly leveraged and complex bets, are based on the assumption that counterparties will always fulfill their obligations. But when this fundamental assumption collapses, when banks or institutions default, everything else will follow suit, triggering a chain reaction of failures. Once that chain is ignited, no amount of money or policy maneuvering in the world will be enough to repair the damage or restore trust. The entire system could be shattered, with consequences so severe that the financial fabric as we know it would be irreparably torn apart.